LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Brian Czech, who joins us to discuss his new book, Supply Shock: Economic Growth at the Crossroads and the Steady State Solution. Politicians, economists and Wall Street would have us believe that limitless economic growth is the Holy Grail, and that there is no conflict between growing the economy and protecting the environment. Supply Shock debunks these widely accepted myths and demonstrates that we are in fact navigating the end of the era of economic growth, and that the only sustainable alternative is the development of a steady state economy. Czech presents a compelling alternative to growth based on keen scientific, economic and political insights. These include the trophic theory of money, the overlooked source of technological progress that prevents us from reconciling growth and environmental protection, and bold yet practical policies for establishing a steady state economy. Supply Shock leaves no doubt that the biggest idea of the 20th century, economic growth, has become the biggest problem of the 21st. Hello and welcome, Brian, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg.
Now, today, Brian, we're going to discuss your latest book, which is called Supply Shock. But perhaps before we do that, just for those who don't know, it's worth mentioning that you're the founder of the Centre for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy, and this is the leading organisation promoting the transition from unsustainable growth to a new economic paradigm. So before we get into the details of the book, perhaps you could just lay out, for those who are new to this, a few of the core concepts behind the idea.
Well, the steady state economy, I think, is best understood by starting with reminding ourselves of what economic growth is. Economic growth is simply increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. That's the key phrase I think that people tend to forget sometimes, in the aggregate. So it's not just the growth of the solar panel sector here while the oil sector is declining there. You know, that might or might not be part of a growing economy. But the main thing in economic growth is that you have increasing production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so that entails increasing population and or per capita production and consumption. And all of this is indicated by a growing GDP, or gross domestic product. So that's economic growth, and we've studied this to death in ecological economics. We know it is not sustainable, and the sustainable alternative then is the steady state economy. Actually, when you think about what the alternatives to growth are, there are but two basic alternatives. One is degrowth, and of course in the long run that's not sustainable either. So that leaves one other option, which is a stabilized or steady state economy. And based on our definition of economic growth, well, then the steady state economy is stabilized or mildly fluctuating production and consumption of goods and services in the aggregate. And so that entails a stabilized population and levels of per capita consumption. And all else equal, it's indicated by stabilized GDP.
And yet, Brian, by far the dominant paradigm in the world today, particularly the industrialized West, is pro-growth. That only continuing, expanding economic growth is best for the well-being of all of us. And even in the wake of the financial crash of 07-08, we've seen contraction of economic growth. All we get now from economists, politicians, and business people, by and large, is got to get back to growth. It's still the dominant paradigm, despite all the warning signals and all the evidence coming in to the contrary.
Yeah, it seems crazy, doesn't it? For people with backgrounds in ecology or natural resources or just the countryside, this is a really crazy sort of approach to financial and fiscal crisis, is constantly pulling out all the stops for even more growth with desperate measures, like Keystone pipelines. But the only way it can be explained is that economics is a profession that has come unrooted from the land, and the practitioners of economics in government service and also in corporate service, they are immersed and thoroughly subjected in their education to a paradigm that ignores land as a factor of production. To them, the basic production function is sort of central to their thinking, which is production is a function of capital and labor. And land was sort of left in the dust of classical economics of the 19th century. And it's been a horrible development for economics to the degree that it's supposed to reflect reality.
Because once you factor land, it might seem strange to some people coming to this for the first time that is actually excluded. But once you factor land back into economic equations, it really is a game changer. And you explain in the book a quite insidious and very calculating way in which land was, in the early 20th century, was removed from these calculations.
Yeah, that's right. This is a very overlooked episode in the corruption of economics. Those of us who look at the production function you see in a basic micro or macro textbook, this production is a function of capital and labor. We've wondered about this for years, for decades, I suppose. What happened to land in that production function? I think the answer can be found, and this is what I explain in chapter 3 of the book Supply Shock here. I think it can be explained by the political backlash against Henry George, who wrote the book Progress and Poverty, published in 1878. And this was a huge book and movement at the time. He proposed what they called the single tax on land. In other words, only land rents would be taxed. No capital and no wage taxes. This would have been a revolutionary approach to the tax code compared to what we ended up getting. In a sense, what Henry George was to the land baron of the late 19th century is akin to what Karl Marx was to the capitalist. And so this movement for a single tax on land really threatened the big land barons of the United States especially, and where George operated primarily. And so this backlash against George manifested in the establishment of economics departments in the United States. And by the way, this is all very well documented by an economic historian and economist, Mason Gaffney, who wrote the book, The Corruption of Economics. What I got out of it and put into Supply Shock is the implications of that backlash and that corruption of the development of neoclassical economics, the implications of that to the production function and this landless economic growth theory that really damages us today.
Now, it's interesting that in some economic reform circles, the issue of a land tax is coming up today, and it is certainly timely. And also the idea of taxing consumption rather than earnings, trying to sort of turn the tables a little bit and change the emphasis on how we organize the system.
Well, that's right. And by the way, I don't want to make it sound like a single tax on land would be a silver bullet or anything for sustainability. It certainly would have some advantages and also some disadvantages. It would really drive landowners to produce on their land. It would end the speculation in land markets. But you see, the real key point here, I think, in terms of us understanding why neoclassical econ is so unrooted, not of this earth, as I call the chapter in the book, is that the backlash against George resulted ultimately in this landless production function. And it's that paradigm that creates this ignorance of land. Now, the tax on land, just cover that a little bit more. Yeah, you do see a lot of followers of Henry George, the Georgists, as it were, that continue to push tax on the full land rents. In other words, any advantage that a landowner would have by owning that property would be removed. Any financial advantage to that would be gone. It's virtually like socializing land, except that people would still have title to tracts of land. But once again, that does have a lot of advantages in terms of social justice and would solve a lot of problems. When it comes to, however, the establishment of a steady state economy, that would not be a panacea. It probably would be roughly neutral in terms of assisting in the establishment of a steady state.
And we have a situation here, and you just brought to mind by what you just said, in the city where I live, a very beautiful place, but there are certain sections of the city centre which are owned by a big UK company called Land Securities. And they've owned this for years and years, I mean decades, and it's undeveloped and it looks really bad. And they applied at various stages to develop it in a certain way that they wanted to commercially, and the city wouldn't give them permission to do it their way. So they've basically raised the middle finger and saying, fine, we'll just let this sit here and rot.
Yeah, well, the middle finger would sure drop if there had been the George's tax on land rents.
Now, we're talking about economics. There is, even amongst some so-called experts, ignorance about some of the actual genuine fundamentals, but certainly the public ignorance about economics is widespread. And I suppose it's not pitched to us as an interesting thing or something that we should take interest in. In fact, because it's so detached from reality, it seems very esoteric to us. I mean, I was taught, for example, I did economics at high school, and I was taught that a world of unlimited wants, unlimited goods, unlimited services was not only possible, but it was desirable.
Yeah, well, I think that's a fairly common experience in the curricula in high school and college and universities, and that really does redound to that landless production function, that landless paradigm. That's one of the very reasons that this ecological economics movement got rolling in the latter decades of the 20th century. It was based on the recognition that neoclassical econ had really gone astray and was at this point in history with, as I call this point in history, supply shock in the aggregate, in the macroeconomic sense, with supply curves moving inward rapidly left and right. This is not the time for a landless production function and trying to, just squeeze every bit possible out of the earth to feed the capital requirements for growth.
There's also the jaw-dropping revelation in your book that in some cases economics became detached from physical reality in order that economists could simplify their equations and kind of make them work, which is just insane.
Well, when I started exploring, investigating what happened to the production function, I remember an economist in an audience that I was speaking to at a university. She offered as an alternative explanation the fact that, yes, in a textbook, for example, where you're trying to display to the student how the production function works, you, with a two-factor production function, such as labor and capital, can simply graph that on an X and Y axis and then have sort of a pseudo three-dimensional third axis showing out that, jutting out, that then gives you sort of the conical expression, if you can imagine that, of a growing economy based partly on additional capital inputs, partly on additional labor inputs. But you cannot take on another factor of production. That would make it three-dimensional, which you can't express in a textbook. So I don't know. I reject that explanation on the grounds that it's always labor and capital that are the two left standing, the two that are used. If neoclassical economics was rooted in reality and in the natural sciences, why then you would have several chapters that would, with the different combinations of the factors of production and the different graphs, and as well as the lengthy discussion of all three of the basic factors and the various tangents to them.
Now, it's one thing to come to terms with the idea that endless economic growth needs to come to an end, but another wrinkle in this is that it can't be steady or sustainable from this point we are now. There does need to be some economic contraction. And you point out in an early chapter of the book, a lot of the systems that sustain society, particularly industrial society, I mean, water, quality of the soil, the food chain, oil production, energy in general, a lot of these areas are in crisis. And this is telling us something about, the perpetual growth model. But the idea of economic contraction, even relatively modest to try and get to a sustainable point, that's a very tough sell. When you appreciate the fact that politicians can't even contemplate the end of endless economic growth, never mind talk about sustainability.
And at CASI, that's how we pronounce our acronym for Center for the Advancement of the Steady State Economy. It's sort of a motto in the background that we have is one paradigm shift at a time, because you're right, it's a tough enough sell to pitch the conscientious and intentional stabilization of GDP and the size of the economy, much less to slam the gears from forward to reverse on a dime and start intentionally contracting the size of the economy. And furthermore, in the long run, it is the steady state economy that's the only really sustainable option for maintaining a human economic system. So, we recognize at CASI, and we're very much collaborating with the degrowth movement, which you probably know about more than I do in Europe. La décroissance, they call it, I guess, in France. Pardon my bad French. But, I've been to some of their conferences, and they're very much on board with what we're doing, with our position on economic growth, that recognizes that there's a limit to growth, there's a fundamental conflict between growth and environmental protection, and that the onus at this point in history is really on the wealthiest countries to commence ratcheting down their growth rates, and then ultimately, probably, yes, going through some contraction so that other really, truly poverty-stricken countries that truly do need economic growth for a decent standard of living will have the capacity, considered in the global context, to do so.
One of my pet peeves, something that I take great issue with, is in the black magic of the money markets. I mean, all the sort of speculation that goes on there, but particularly with derivatives. And derivatives are bad enough, but when they're resource-based, this, it seems to me, causes incredible distortions in price, and this really affects these markets. Now, some claim, the idea of futures, I can see how useful that could be, but derivatives in themselves do seem to have a terribly insidious effect overall.
Yeah, well, they create this illusion that there is no limit to growth because you can, if you're into that sector, be making money with seemingly nothing happening except, new calculations and new winnings in your gamblings, if you will. It's like being in a casino, but it is an illusion if you're thinking that everyone in that casino is going to be making more and more money. The winners in derivatives are countered by losers in other derivatives and other money markets. And meanwhile, Greg, it just doesn't reflect at all what's going on in the real world of the earth and the agricultural and extractive sectors that are the foundation of the real economy. By real economy, we have to remember there is something in our neoclassical textbooks that is at once profound and at once also recognized in ecological economics as horribly insufficient, and that's called the circular flow of money. Remember that thing? It's you've got the flow of real goods and services going in one direction in a circle. In the most basic diagram, you see it flowing between the firms and the households, showing your capital and labor. And in the other direction, you've got the money flowing for the acquisition of these goods and services, producer and consumer goods and services. This is a real profound diagram in the sense that you bet that monetary sector has to and does ultimately reflect the real sector. But when you start having crazy games with in the money markets with the derivatives and so forth, that money supply, the circular flow of money begins to expand outward and outward, and it's as if it is leaving planet Earth, and that's exactly what it is doing. And then that can't be sustained, and it bursts, and it, if you will, comes back down to Earth. And so that's pretty much explains in a nutshell what's happened with recent financial and fiscal crises.
Have you looked at the issue of high-frequency trading? This is basically where computer software is used to trade stocks, and they can make buying and sell decisions in milliseconds. Because I was listening to something on this yesterday, and it seems that's another sort of piece of evidence for how detached from reality economics and money markets have become.
These methods, computer-based methods to be able to capitalize, if you will, instantly on a shift in prices and so forth, why, I guess you can kind of envision that as a lot of roughly analogous to a sunspot activity on the surface of that circular flow of money. It's all kinds of little disturbances, but once again, it's got no reflection of what's truly happening. It's certainly not in a macroeconomic way now. It doesn't have the level of activity, the number of times the numbers get crunched and transactions occur with this computerized stock buying and selling. That in no way reflects the amount of real economic activity. I hope everybody can see right through that. So if people are pitching that as some way to continuously grow the economy and make more and more money without using more and more resources, well, they're going to be sorely disappointed.
Now, the politicization of economics is a major problem. And in America particularly, not so much in Europe, but in America, the issue of corporate funding of politics, quite often by the back door, it has a major, major effect on how the system runs. And of course, economics also has emotion involved in it. And when you put that all together, it really creates a very distorted result.
Yeah, well, that's for sure. And, that's why once again, we go back to the wisdom of the classical economists of the 19th century. Before there was a field of study called economics, those classical economists referred to their area of study as political economy, demonstrating in one swift phrase the inextricable nature of politics and economics. And you can see this when you look at the very definitions of the basic conventional definitions of economics and politics. They're virtually synonymous, except that with the definition of economics, it doesn't really put the emphasis on the social aspects of the allocation and distribution, the allocation of the means of production and the distribution of wealth. Whereas in politics, the basic definition is who gets what, when, and how. So these are inextricable systems, and so of course politics plays a major role in economic affairs and vice versa.
Now, what a lot of people don't take into account, perhaps because they don't realize it because they're not being told this by the media or by their mainstream politicians, is that GDP, gross domestic product, includes lots of bad things. It's basically just a crude measure of economic activity. So say, for example, you have a bird flu epidemic, then all the vaccines to treat sick people, all the ambulance journeys, all of that will increase GDP, but could hardly be claimed to be a good thing. And of course, the GDP figures are manipulated to some extent anyway, and they're really of limited use. There was that famous quote you're probably aware of from Bobby Kennedy, who basically said that, summed up by saying that GDP really doesn't measure anything that genuinely contributes to human well-being or happiness.
I think we have to be a little bit careful on this subject, because it's true that, for example, if you're spending money on in the hospital, it's a negative experience for the patient to be there. But of course, if there is a cure provided, or that is a good thing. There's no doubt about that. So in GDP, there is a real mix of good and bad things that are all crunched up into the big number. But I think the real use of GDP for our purposes in this subject of sustainability and moving away from unsustainable growth to a sustainable, steady-state economy is pretty easy to grasp. It is that GDP cannot continuously grow. It has got to stabilize at some point. There are some in the ecological economics movement, good friends of mine and colleagues, that would prefer to simply eliminate GDP entirely, on the grounds that, well, then you would take away the focus of continuously trying to grow that thing and therefore growing the real economy. But on the other hand, I feel that GDP it's in there for good, certainly for a long time to come. But let's start interpreting it differently. It's sort of like, I like to use the metaphor of the obese patient. If you're a doctor, you've got an obese patient. That patient needs to stop gaining weight. The last thing you're going to tell that patient to do is to throw away the scale. In fact, at this point, that patient needs the scale more than he or she ever has. They need to monitor that weight very closely. So when we've got a $70-some trillion global GDP, and we know that a sustainable global GDP is probably closer to 40-some trillion, why, we better keep measuring it, but interpreting the results with more and more alarm. And meanwhile, we've got to start using a blood pressure cuff and a stethoscope in addition to the scale to get other measures of this patient's health, so that we can, assess when we're doing the right and wrong things for the big patient, the economy, the people of the nation, the people of the planet. So things like the Genuine Progress Indicator, or GPI, the Human Development Index, the Index of Sustainable Economic Welfare. These other indices we have to incorporate for a more holistic picture of the patient's health.
You also get into the issue of green growth, so-called, which is kind of an oxymoron. And most public-facing corporations these days have got some kind of green policy, perhaps a green department, green officer, green page on their website. And I was on the website of Mall of America the other day, and I was looking at their green credentials. And the main thing they were talking about was the sheer volume of stuff they were recycling, and that this actually was contributing to their green credentials. But The logic there is basically that the more stuff is consumed at Mall of America, the more recycling they can do, therefore the greener they are.
Well, that brings up a whole other dimension of green, sort of like gagging green. That's embarrassing that we would have places like that in this country or anywhere that would be trying to pull the wool over our eyes that ridiculously.
Technical development and innovation is an important aspect of growth, but there has been evidence now for some time that the rate and number of new innovations is declining. The everyday perception is that technology continues to advance and more technological wonders are coming along every day. But really, I think we have a misplaced faith in the ability of technology to solve every problem, and particularly to facilitate never-ending growth.
That's for sure. And, this, I think, is the thing that I probably emphasize the most in supply shock. This is a really thorny issue. Technically it's the single most complex issue that we have to deal with in sustainability and in steady state economics and in ecological economics versus neoclassical econ. I should maybe take a quick relevant diversion here and just point out, in case people haven't heard all these terms in the past, ecological economics is the primary ecologically informed alternative to conventional or neoclassical economics. Steady state economics is simply the macroeconomic arm or the macroeconomic emphasis of ecological economics. So those two practices and studies are totally consistent with each other. Now, going back to the issue of technological progress, what has long been overlooked in the studies and the conferences and the policies pertaining to science and technology is where the technological progress really comes from. It's not like manna from heaven, like it used to be talked about in earlier neoclassical growth models. And it's also not adequately explained in our state-of-the-art conventional or neoclassical growth models either. What gets overlooked is that it took a tremendous amount of resources to conduct the research and development to begin with. And more importantly, you had to have economic surplus in order to conduct the research and development to get the technological progress. So in other words, after you've paid off all the factors of production, the rents, the wages, the interest, and so on, only what you have left over, and that's after you've had your corporate banquets and your vacations and so forth as well. What you have left after all of that can be spent on R&D to generate technological progress, which then raises the bar for even more economic growth, theoretically, for some period of time. The problem is, where does that money really come from? Well, that's where you get in trouble with the landless production function, because you fail to recognize that the money itself, the amount of real money, which reflects, as we talked about earlier, that circular flow money, real money, meaning not inflated. Solid real money does reflect the amount of real economic activity occurring out there. And that real economic activity is founded upon the agricultural and extractive sectors. That's the foundation of the economy. And to have economic surplus to spend on R&D, a growing surplus to spend on more R&D to get more technological progress for more economic growth, you have to have an expanding agricultural and extractive presence on the land. And that's an expanding ecological footprint, and that is what is unsustainable.
Now, since the advent of the internet, there's been a growing trend towards sharing information. A lot of it was quote unquote illegal open source software. This does seem to me to be sort of the wave of the future, so to speak. And the problem for economic growthists in all of that is that the copyright and ownership of ideas is a very important aspect of, economic corporate activity and therefore growth. And this might seem perhaps like a side issue, but the reason I think it's important to consider is because in facing some of the ecological problems that we have on the planet, open source kind of work, sharing ideas, making technology available wherever it's needed, not wherever it can be afforded, is actually quite important consideration.
Yeah, I agree. It's a bit of a conundrum, this issue of whether to protect the so-called rights of people to their intellectual, people and firms to their intellectual property. And under the old paradigm, the growth obsessed paradigm, you did that so that firms would have the incentive to invest in research and development. But I think that number one, what really again gets overlooked is whether it's open source or privatized or protected by patent or whatever, that part doesn't matter as much as the fact that you have to have more and more surplus at the agro-extractive base to get more and more research and development. And that is just what is not sustainable. The issue about patenting, whether or not to do that, whether to have copyright versus copyleft kinds of systems, that I think is more about economic justice and fairness and distribution of wealth than it is about sustainability. Although actually that you may be onto something there, Greg, because it's true that you do have to have an equitable distribution of wealth to have a fighting chance at a politically viable steady state economy as well. You can't settle into a steady state if the 99% is poverty stricken while you have 1% living like hogs.
Where we've seen some problems, malfeasance in the corporate world, I think Enron springs to mind. One of the main issues, and this does affect discussions around growth and where we're headed, is the sort of lack of personal accountability quite often. I know people in Enron were jailed and what have you, but the general trend really is that lack of accountability results in corporations which seem to have the same legal rights as people do in many cases. They become this sort of pseudo entity, and that in itself causes this detachment from the outcomes of actions. It's quite common. We saw this in the banking crisis, that people at the tops of companies would cause enormous mayhem and destruction beneath them and then basically walk away with maybe a slap on the hand, but probably with their pension intact. In fact, there's a documentary I'd recommend for people if they haven't seen it called The Corporation. That came out in 2003, and it lays all of this out very clearly.
Right, and sure, the whole too big to fail genre, it's sort of gotten away with. It. This behavior is deemed relatively acceptable as part of this obsession with economic growth, because these figures that are allowed to get away with all these shenanigans are viewed as somehow having the ability more than anybody else to so-called stimulate further economic growth. That attitude itself, that opinion, that conclusion is way off base, because they don't have that capacity. That, in fact, it's the opposite. At this point in history, not understanding supply shock, they are the last ones that are going to help us out in the real sense of economic health.
Population and economic growth are intimately linked, and we have the absurd situation where endless economic growth demands endless population growth. Now, if people think that endless economic growth is actually desirable or even possible, if you then say, it then demands endless population growth, that can bring people up sometimes because it's very obvious, well, that's just absolutely impossible, nor is it desirable. So therefore, we can work backwards from that and say, okay, well, we need to do something about unchecked economic growth.
Yeah, you're really on to something there. And this is where you get some interesting sectors in the economics profession showing up, because in conventional economics, neoclassical economics, you do have this growing recognition that, well, okay, we for many years now have recognized that population growth is required for economic growth, but wait a minute, even despite the claims of pop economists like Julian Simon and so forth, we can have perpetually growing population, can we? So what this one little sector in the economics profession has tried to develop or establish in principle is that, oh, wait a minute, we can have economic growth with a stabilized population. We just have perpetual growth in per capita production and consumption of goods and particularly services. Well, once again, it's not at all rooted in the reality of what is required for perpetual production and consumption of goods and services. You've got the land as a the real key and factor of production, in the sense that it's labor and capital that combine to convert, to transform natural resources on the physical space that these operations are allotted. What I'm getting at there is land is a factor of production, both in the sense of it's a space. You have to have some space to produce and consume, right? But also it's the natural resources from that space that you bring into the production process, beginning with the most basic ones like water and oil. They have gone barking up the wrong tree. There's analysis of so many trees in neoclassical econ without seeing the forest, and this is just another example of that.
I'm sure this would be an immensely complex calculation, but does anybody have any idea what sustainability for 7 billion people would actually look like? Can everyone have a car? Can everyone have a fridge? Can everyone have air conditioning? Can everyone have a bathroom they don't share with anyone else? Does everyone even have a sewage system? It seems impossible to envision.
Yes, it does. And it's frustrating for those of us in ecological economics, because we're not funded to the hilt like neoclassical economics departments are, and so we can't get around to every research topic. But to the degree that this issue is studied, it's studied usually under the rubric or with the framework of a method called the ecological footprint, where you do ascertain the amount of acreage required for a certain level of economic activity. And there's a reasonably well-developed literature and art to this at this point, and science. And the indications are that, for example, as I recall, if everyone on the planet consumed as the average American consumes, it would take something like 23 planet Earths. So that's how far beyond sustainable the American consumption level is. And so your question about whether or not everybody could have those various things you listed, nobody's got the answer to that. There certainly isn't an omniscient ecological economist, much less neoclassical economist. So we don't know that, but what we do have are indicators left and right of ecological unraveling. We've got a burgeoning list of threatened and endangered species in the U.S. and around the world. That's a clear set. These are like canaries in a coal mine, dropping left and right. If that doesn't tip us off that we're going beyond a sustainable level of economic activity, I don't know what else could.
Now, I mentioned earlier the issue of emotion coming into economics, and kind of parallel with that, it seems to me that one of the big issues that human beings face when confronting all these issues is actually psychological. It's not so much that we couldn't change the way that we live, and we could probably live better as a result, but we have a psychological barrier which has wedded us to a particular paradigm. And as we know with human psychology. Our brains are are rats' mazes, and it sometimes can be very, very difficult to get a rational outcome when you factor in human emotion.
That's a real challenge. To the degree that we can't develop rational policies to deal with real problems, that's not something that would be limited, I suppose, to sustainability matters, but it's definitely a problem in a lot of policy issues. Certainly see that in the U.S. with a number of issues. So I think that to the degree we recognize that there's a lot of emotion that comes into this, and if we have endeavored to advance the steady state economy as a policy goal, we do have to connect then with these emotions. And we need to point out, for example, that we're not talking about tree hugging here. We're not talking about establishing a steady state economy just to stop endangering more and more species. I mean, that's part of it, of course. But what we're really talking about is not pulling the rug out from our own kids and grandkids. And if that doesn't get to the emotions of people when they look at their own kids and their own grandkids, well, then I guess there would be not much hope.
And also it strikes me that if we could bring an end to, or as close to an end as we can get to, the cycle of boom and bust, we'd all be a lot better off. Because some people win, of course, in boom times, but so many people across the board lose in bust. We saw that with the financial crash, that's ongoing actually, which I mentioned earlier. But despite the contraction in economic growth since then, income equality is actually still on the rise. Wealth is becoming concentrated in fewer hands, and the liquidating class, as you called them, they're already in some parts of the world effectively paying security forces to suppress dissent against this situation. And I was reading the other day that in the US anyway, luxury brands such as Porsche and Rolex are doing better than ever.
Well, that's not a good sign. The paradigm shift to move from growth to a steady state certainly is something that has to occur far and wide, not just in the policy-making circles of the Fed and Congress and so forth. Yeah, you mentioned that this term, the liquidating class, because I think that there is a latent attitude of people around the world, including Americans, against such raunchy kind of consumption levels. The Hummer driving and the McMansion building and the fur coats and the things like this. I think as more and more people begin to recognize how what we were talking about before, that if everybody behaved like that, you'd really be pulling the rug out quickly from your kids and grandkids. And so now we have to recognize is that this liquidating class, they're pulling out the rug disproportionately. They're pulling out the rug from our kids and our grandkids at a much faster rate than we are. And so we have to avoid a civil war here based on consumption levels, but yet we do have to nudge the behavior of the conspicuous consumer downward, and in the process you would precipitate sort of a flattening of the levels of consumption, and where the average level would be declining, the propensity to consume would be declining. If you want to use Keynesian economics terms, you'd say the propensity to consume is declining, and so you would have a demand in the aggregate that would be more fitting with supply shock. And you could, for some time, until we came into the political willpower to establish as a goal and as a policy the steady state economy, you could in effect be moving in that direction simply by lowering the propensity to consume.
Well, you also point out in the book that sustainability, humans on the earth, it's not an unprecedented state of affairs. In fact, if you look back across millennia, it appears to be the norm, and many indigenous societies even today live in a sustainable fashion. And the idea of doing this in a modern context is not unheard of. There's a lot of intentional communities trying to live in this way. It's just a question of, as I mentioned earlier, dealing with the fact that there's a hell of a lot more people now than there were, even a couple of hundred years ago.
That's right, and I think what a lot of folks in ecological economics would attribute the difference between those millennia of relatively sustainable tribal cultures to the horribly unsustainable situation we've encountered now is oil, the development of the industrial fossil-fueled economy, because that is, what has enabled us to extract resources in a way that was never possible under tribal cultures. It wasn't so much the difference between a tribal system, tribal social system, and these modern systems of political economy. It was more having to do with the levels of technology being employed at these respective periods in time. Now, of course, there are those who study complexity theory and so forth that would make the point, and this is fine. It's a fine point that you wouldn't have these highly complex governments and systems of political economy in general without that tremendous amount of energy surplus that you do have when you learn how to use fossil fuels and start burning them up. But as we liquidate these fossil fuels, liquidate the stocks of coal and petroleum, why that then points to us having to accept a gradual simplification of some of our governance and letting go of some of the policies and government programs. This, by the way, I'll say one last thing about this. This points to a natural connection of our movement in steady state economics with what you might consider, in the U.S. at least, what you would consider the right on the political spectrum. Conservatives against big and fancy government. I want to point out in general, in fact, that the move toward a steady state economy has connections all along the political spectrum. It's absolutely not a leftist or a rightist or a centrist. It's pretty much apolitical, but we do have obvious connections with the desires and the emphases of political operatives all along the spectrum.
Thinking about the future and other different ways of doing things, are you familiar with the blue economy concept by Gunter Pauli, which is basically a zero waste economy in which it could potentially do a lot for employment because it would be a lot more human labor intensive?
Well, I certainly, as you know, having read Supply Shock, I'm certainly an advocate of it's a nasty sounding phrase, I'm afraid, for a lot of people, that labor intensification. But we should point out what we mean by that is putting people back to work in meaningful jobs. Like in the United States during the Great Depression, one thing that moved it back toward a steadier state was the establishment of the Civilian Conservation Corps, where young people were hired to do really very meaningful work, construction of infrastructure and buildings in places like national parks and national forests that we still see standing today and take great pride in, pride of workmanship. That's labor intensification. It just means we have real jobs, not flipping burgers in McDonald's as much as creating things from the natural resources that are durable and lasting in a steady state economy.
Okay, in closing, Brian, just to go out on a positive note, if we're to roll back from the precipice, so to speak, that we're facing across energy, environment, economy, basically you describe how we can seek a prosperous way down from this, because it's not really about giving things up, about losing things, about suffering. It's about actually finding a better and more sustainable way to live, to just make our peace with the planet, so to speak, and thinking about future generations, how things can be put in place so that they can have the sort of, decent lives that many of us have enjoyed, and the people who are not having decent lives right now can live better as well. And I see many positive developments out there, one of which is certainly the rise of localism, because in my mind anyway, economic growth is very much tied in with globalization, and we're seeing globalization in some senses going into reverse.
Yes, we should go out on a positive note, and at the same time, I don't want to be viewed, and I don't want steady state economics to be portrayed as either optimistic or pessimistic. It's a very realistic approach because it is so based in the real sectors, which then are based on the land. And one positive aspect, however, of the reality is that we wouldn't have to give up a lot to move toward a great degree more sustainable in places like the United States, because right now there's a lot of fat in the economy. I mean, you move around the landscape, you will see things like artificial waterfalls in Las Vegas, Nevada, where that just doesn't fit, and it's totally unnecessary. And those kinds of things can be weeded out. The Hummer driving, the NASCAR racing, the going around in circles as fast as you can, using up as much oil as that takes, and as well as the the smorgasbord of chemicals that go into that whole sector. We have these things that can be weeded out with really very little impact on the health, or with a positive impact on the health and happiness of people at large. When you go around the planet, you see other major pockets of these kinds of fats, if you will, that can be dealt with first. The Dubais of the world, for example. So there is a starting point to this that wouldn't have a major impact on the standard of living of the 99.9%. But I think it's also realistic to recognize that politically, this does entail some really rolling up of the sleeves and getting down to work and demanding reform in fiscal and monetary policy making, where we really do stop pulling out all the stops for GDP growth, and we start to set those levers and buttons back toward a sustainable, steady state economy.
Well, Brian, your book, once again, Supply Shock, is widely available, but perhaps you'd like to tell people about the website and anything else you'd like to share.
Oh, sure. So the CASI website is www.steadystate.org, and you can get Supply Shock from there, or it'll connect you to the publisher and to the Amazon and all that. And we have a tremendous amount of resources at steadystate.org. Another book that came out in 2013, Enough is Enough by Rob Dietz and Dan O'Neill, another excellent book on steady state economics. We've got links to a lot of Herman Daly's original works in steady state econ. We have slideshows and videos, and we also have a position on economic growth that people can sign. And this is something that, talk about rolling up the sleeves, doing the dirty political work to advance an issue. Nothing speaks to a politician as much as money, but the thing that speaks next most loudly is signatures. So that's how we can eventually start making enough of an impression upon these politicians to start taking this seriously and start ratcheting back those levers and buttons.
Excellent. Well, Brian, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Thank you, Greg.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoy the show, please check out the website. That's legalizefreedom.com, legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including world affairs, politics and economics, science and technology, religion and spirituality, conspiracy, and alternative history. You can also browse and buy a range of books and DVDs from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to LegalizeFreedom.com.